All right. Hey, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for checking out this video. I really appreciate it. If you have not already, like and subscribe. If you want to share this video, that would be great too. So I want to make a video. I'm going to try and make it quite short, but I want to talk about something that's very important, and it's something that we talk about a lot, but I think it's not always very well understood. And the reason that it's not always very well understood is because it can be an obscure topic. And what I want to talk about is discernment. So, again, this is a word we throw around a lot. What exactly does discernment mean? How are we typically using that word? What are the ways in which we use that term? Typically, what are we talking about when we're speaking about having to use discernment? So, I want to make a short video and just talk about this a little bit. So, again, this is not going to be exhaustive coverage of exactly what discernment is. That's not what this is meant to be. All I want to do is I want to define it. I want to give you just my perspective as to what I think it is. And then I also want to give you just a couple of quick tips as to how I think that we all can perhaps refine our ability to conduct discernment. And when I say we, I want you to know that I'm including myself in that too. Like these are things that I think that I can do more of, that I think will refine my own sense of discernment, because I'm not here to tell you that I have perfect discernment or even great discernment. What I'm saying is this is something that we all can improve on, even for those who probably already have a great use of discernment as it is. So, all right, the first thing that I want to do is I just want to go through a couple of definitions of discernment, and then we can talk about more colloquially what we think it is. But if we look at a definition for discernment from the dictionary, what do we get? So I'm just reading right now from the American Heritage Dictionary. Some of you are probably going to critique my usage of this dictionary over that dictionary or whatever, but I actually like this definition, which is why I'm using it. So the entry for discernment from the American Heritage Dictionary says that it is one, the act or process of exhibiting keen insight and good judgment. Two, keenness of insight and judgment. So I like that. Keen insight and judgment, or the act of using keen insight and judgment. I think that's a pretty succinct definition. I think that's great. Okay, this is just from vocabulary.com. Again, just online, searching for vocabulary.com, looking at discernment. And this gives a couple of different definitions, and I like these too, and I'm going to read all of them. This says, number one, the cognitive condition of someone who understands. Two, the mental ability to understand and discriminate between relations. Three, the trait of judging wisely and objectively. Four, delicate discrimination. Five, perception of that which is obscure. So there are a couple things that I like from this too. So first of all, from this series of definitions from vocabulary.com, it mentions as definitions for discernment this cognitive condition of someone who understands. I like that. I also like the two definitions that mention discrimination, because I do think that a key aspect of discernment is learning to understand distinction or discriminating between this and that. And sometimes that need to discriminate can be subtle because what you're distinguishing can be subtle. And then the other thing that I like from this is the fifth definition, perception of that which is obscure. And I really like that one as well, because I do think that when we're talking about discernment, one, it's not that it's an overly abstract term, but I think sometimes it's used in abstract ways, or it's used in ways that are obscure, which is kind of funny because, again, discernment a lot of times in the ways in which we use it means that we are trying to judge between things that may be obscure or discriminate between this or that. And a lot of times we use discernment nowadays when we are talking about being selective about what we choose to support or what we choose to agree with or align with, whenever we're talking about where to find truth, what sources to follow, what perspectives to look at things from. individuals with which we may wish to align, or potentially even, political parties or groups or whatever. But also when we choose to read this book over that book, or take our news from this source over that source, there could be some discernment in deciding to distinguish between this or that, or go here first over that, etc. So I think that's why it's important for us to understand exactly what we're talking about. So, what type of people use discernment? Well, if we were to think about this in terms of occupations, what are the occupations in which people have to discern? It's a part of their job. Well, I mean, I came from the military. Obviously, you have a lot of intelligence operatives, for the government, whether in the military or other governmental departments. But a large part of their job requires discernment as to what sources may be valid, what information therefore may be valid, how to analyze that information, etc. But also think about, very similarly, think about detectives that are conducting police investigations. So detectives are having to sift through a lot of information, and they're going to have to prioritize what they think is more valuable for whatever reason. And so there's discernment that they're engaging in as they try to filter through a lot of information and then decide what actually has some sort of value in terms of what it may mean for trying to solve a case or determine this or that about a specific case. So yeah, detectives or other criminal investigators clearly have to use discernment. What about diplomats? What about diplomats that are engaging sometimes in very high stakes negotiations, where they're trying to discern what the person across the table may think? And you could take that and you could say, well, even business negotiations, individuals who are engaging in that type of discussion may also be engaging in discernment as they're trying to figure out what it is that the person across the table is thinking or whatever. And I'm not going to get into kind of like game theory discussions or anything with this, because I want this to be short. And I don't necessarily want to go down any one specific route with this. I mean, maybe we could discuss that in the future, but I want to keep this kind of short and succinct. So, why is discernment important? Well, a lot of us, kind of in this space, we're concerned about truth. And we're concerned about truth because we want to align with truth, and we want to live our lives according to certain principles. Now, many people, when they use discernment, they're using discernment in a spiritual sense, or they at least believe that there can be a spiritual quality to discernment. I would agree with that. I also think that spiritual discernment is important, and I also think that there can be some sort of whether you want to call it spiritual or whether you want to call it intuitive, but I also think there's some sort of capacity like that that can be used to discern. Though I also think it's easy to be deceived and to think that you're using intuition when in reality you're perhaps being emotionally manipulated. But that's also why discernment is very important. It's important for us to discern because we are guarding against manipulation. We want to understand the information that comes to us and then be able to kind of use that information in a way that drives our decision making in the ways that we want to go. Drive our decision making so that we're making the best decisions, or the decisions that are in our own interest, and not being manipulated to go in another way that is actually harmful to us, sometimes without even realizing. So that's why I think discernment is important. I think most people would agree that that's why discernment is important. But how do we refine our discernment skills? Because we live in an environment where we are bombarded with information. Some of it's good and some of it's bad. And remember, bad information, it can be disinformation, which is willfully meant to deceive you, or misinformation, which is just, incorrect information. The person who propagates that information may not have the intent to deceive, but the information may still be poor. So we live in this obscure world where we're bombarded with information. It is so hard to know what's true. Our history is murky. We can't trust necessarily what we're told, via the media. We can't trust what we hear from the government. So where are you going to try and find truth? Now, for those who are very spiritually minded, You say, well, ultimately truth comes from God. And I agree with that. But deciding, so even if you totally agree with that, but where exactly do you find that truth? Because that's not always easy, regardless of how spiritually attuned, some people are. So it's important that we understand that we live in a world in which it can be very difficult to find the truth, adhere to that truth. And that's why it's important to discern. So, how do we do that? How do we get better at discernment? How do we improve our discernment qualities? So, I mentioned a couple things here. One, consume information from a variety of sources and perspectives. All right. Well, what do I mean by that? So, can you listen to the news if you're trying to exercise discernment? Sure. Part of learning to discern is understanding what information is not helpful. Now you may choose to say, "Hey, listen, I'm not going to listen to the news because I think most of it is bogus." That's fine. But even if you largely ignore mainstream media, which I tend to do, I tend to ignore. I mean, I never just sit down and watch the mainstream news. Never, never. But you're still going to come across it. And the fact that you still come across it in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. It's just learning to realize that, okay, this information is not helpful in terms of me knowing that something is true, but it may be helpful in letting me know what the narratives are that are being propagated to the wider public. That in and of itself may be helpful. But also, even having to engage, though I wouldn't do it often, but even if you engage sometimes with bad information, it at least shows you what bad information is. So yeah, I do believe that consuming a lot of information from a variety of sources can be helpful. Some of those sources will be more helpful than others. But by consuming a variety of information, you will learn what is more helpful and what is less helpful. Also, a variety of perspectives. So, are you receiving information just from the media, just from the government? Are you receiving information from other entities? Wherever do you read certain periodicals that are about the financial world, or periodicals that are about this or that or whatever, because those can also be helpful. Now, will they engage in some propaganda? Sure. But you learn over time to be able to understand what is valuable and what's not. But you do that as you engage with more different types of information, and information coming from perspectives. And perspectives is more than just, oh, this person is on the right or this person is on the left. This person is a conservative. This person is a liberal. And that's why I would also encourage people to read information that comes from other parts of the world. And if you can read it in another language, do that. If you can. If you can't, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can go to many other online newspapers from other parts of the world, and a lot of times, they'll have an English translation of their major periodicals, or their major daily journals or whatever. But if you can read them in another language, then figure out, particularly if there's a part of the world that you're interested in. So I spent a lot of time in Latin America. I mean, I spent years of my life in Latin America. I also lived for a couple of years in South Korea. I can read Spanish far better than I can read Korean. But can I read Korean newspapers that are in English? Sure. And can I read newspapers that are from Mexico or Colombia or Chile? Sure. I mean, I can read those in Spanish. But even if I couldn't, I could read just the English translations. But understanding differing sources of information, differing perspectives, again, over time just helps us refine our ability to perceive truth or distinguish between this and that. And reading is key. So I'm talking about newspapers, I'm talking about sources of information, but also books. I mean, I'm a big fan of books. I am. I've been a reader my whole life. I think reading is so important. I think too few people truly read. In fact, a lot of Americans, sadly, it's almost as if they lack the intellectual stamina to be able to get through a book. Read quality nonfiction and fiction. And a couple of years ago, I don't know that I would have said that. But there are great works of fiction. Now, I mean, you can talk about, like classic literature or whatever. But there's also much more contemporary fiction that is also quite valuable. And if you can, read in different languages. If you can't, don't worry about it. But read quality nonfiction and fiction. Read. Can you watch and still consume information, learn to discern? Yes, but you must read. If you don't find time to read, you're not truly interested in discernment. Reading, fiction and nonfiction will allow you to sharpen your brain. And I'll tell you, here's a topic you should read about: espionage. Because if you read about espionage, fiction or nonfiction, or both, it will give you greater insight, keen insight, that's discernment, greater insight into the way our world works because there's so much deception at play. So, number one, consume information from a variety of sources and perspectives. Oh, here's another thing before I move on, actually. I am not the expert here, but engaging with quality music, I'm not talking about popular music. I'm talking about quality music, probably from an earlier era. I am not the expert here, but I do truly believe that if you truly engage with that music, and those of you who understand things like the principle of effect and Lara, which I do not. I barely even know what that means. But the little bit that I do know makes me think that there is what we already know. There is a power in music that can be very helpful. It can also be very harmful. But here we're talking about how to help ourselves. I think engaging with high quality music and art is probably also very helpful in ways that we don't even necessarily truly understand. But I will tell you, stimulating your creativity is a great way to improve your discernment. Okay, so I would kind of include that as well in consuming information, or consuming various types of media. So that's one: consuming information or media from a variety of sources and perspectives. And if you do it in another language where you can, that's helpful because learning a language forces your brain to work in ways that allow you to get better at pattern recognition, which is a great way to stay mentally, healthy, cognitively sharp. But I also think will indirectly assist you in your discernment qualities. All right. So number two, engage in discussions and debates. And yeah, I said debate. That doesn't mean you have to fight or whatever, but just the old Socratic quality of engaging in some sort of discussion with an individual or a debate with an individual who disagrees with you, that will force you to refine your argumentation. That will force you to sharpen your thinking. You got to think more clearly. You have to have an ability to express yourself and articulate a well-crafted argument. And also, at the same time, you will find the holes in someone else's arguments, which in turn will help them to think more clearly, but you'll be able to see where someone else is either poorly articulating an argument or poorly constructing an argument, or there are fallacies in the argument that they have put together. And that takes me to my next point. Study logic and reasoning. Now, a lot of times when we study logic, you can approach it from the direction of math, or you can approach it from philosophy. And, in an earlier time, a lot of your philosophers were mathematicians, and vice versa. We tend to draw sharp distinctions where in a previous era they did not, and you had these greatly polymathic, individuals, etc. But understanding logic and reasoning is also very important. Why? Well, I just mentioned this a minute ago, but understanding patterns and recognizing those patterns or connecting dots. A huge part of discernment is seeing patterns and then kind of trying to infer where they might lead, or dots, which allows you to make decisions amid incomplete information. Again, that's a huge part of discernment. I mentioned argumentation. So understanding the relationship between premises and conclusions. Now, again, we're not having a class here on how to construct an argument, but just you can go and learn more about this on your own. Maybe we can talk about it at a later time. But this is also extremely important. The same thing with understanding hypotheses. And then also causality. These things they're important in terms of logic and reasoning, but they're also important in learning how to discern what has validity that you come across or what doesn't, or what is, perhaps a little bit more valuable than something else. Number four, systems thinking. So understanding what analysis and synthesis mean. Analysis means to, take something and break it apart into its constituent parts. Synthesis means to take things and, put them together. So in that regard, they're kind of they're two steps that kind of go together. They're both very, very important because you want to look at a whole and you want to understand how to kind of break that down. But also, you want to take pieces of information from here or there or wherever, and you want to be able to put those together in a way in which you kind of build a composite picture in your mind that helps you understand something much more clearly. So analysis and synthesis are both very important. Some people would criticize systems thinking because they say, all right, if you look at things in systems, that's a very Western way of thinking. And yeah, okay, that may be true, but that doesn't mean you have to be a rank materialist and that you have to discount other ways in which people engage with information or learn or experience, etc. But learning to think in ways in which you understand, okay, if there is a system and that system has parts and there are relationships between the various discrete parts of the system that impact the way in which the system functions, then yes, that will help you in your qualities of discernment. Again, when we think about complexity or learning to think in complexity, we're understanding that there may be things that have different but related parts. So if something impacts a part here, how does that impact the whole? And is it easy to understand how an impact on this part affects the whole, or is it far more difficult? This is where, complexity becomes much more important, or, if we were talking about complex adaptive systems or whatever, where an input may cause all types of other variability in the system or whatever. That takes me to my next subpoint, which is nonlinearity. And again, we're not going to talk much about this, but nonlinearity is understanding that within a given system, for example, the relationship between inputs to outputs may not necessarily be proportional. If I have a bag and I put something that weighs exactly 1 pound into that bag, the bag will get exactly 1 pound heavier. Why? Because the input equals the output. That's a very simple linear system. We could put that on a graph, on an XY graph, inputs to outputs, and there would be a very, straight line. And you could take another system where you could have, okay, for every 1 unit of input, there is an output of 2 units. So there'd be a 1-to-2 relationship. You can still put that on the graph. It's still a straight line. It would look different than a 1-to-1 relationship or whatever. I guess it would be a slightly, like on an XY graph, it'd be, steeper or whatever, but it's still linear. There's still a linear relationship. But what happens when it's much harder to define the relationship between the inputs and outputs because of the complexity of the system? And therefore it behaves with some form of nonlinearity. But what that means is, hey, that can no longer be graphed in a way that looks like a straight line. There could be some, there could be a curve to it or whatever on the graph. I mean, we're not going to get into math class here, but my point is understanding that many systems, it's much harder to exactly define the relationship between inputs and outputs. But understanding that will help you understand and think better in systems, because many systems are complex or they behave in ways that aren't exactly linear. But as you learn to understand that and kind of negotiate that, your ability to discern will improve. So those are my 4. Consume information from a variety of sources and perspectives, engage in discussions and debates, study logic and reasoning, and then thinking in systems. All right. So the last point that I want to say, this is not necessarily, one of those 4, hey, how do you improve your discernment, but just something we need to think about. Deception is real. We live in a world that is rife with deception. And there are people out there that are trying to manipulate our decision-making. I've talked before about worldview warfare. Worldview warfare is real. They want to change the way we look at the world. They don't just want to impact our actions, they want to impact our beliefs and the way we arrive at our beliefs. Some of this warfare is epistemological. It's not just about what you do. It's not even exactly about what you believe. It's about how you arrive at those beliefs. And they want to attack that. That's why it's so important for us to understand discernment, because a large part of this is spiritual. Spiritual discernment is key. Truth is truth, whether it's about something that is, kind of what we would think of as typically spiritual in nature, or something else. Truth is truth. And so for those of you that are believers, you'll understand the importance of praying to refine your discernment, or reading the scriptures to refine your discernment. And some of you will even understand, going to church or participating liturgically and what that means in terms of just placing yourself in alignment with God, and therefore increasing your abilities to discern. And I realize not everybody is necessarily super, super religious, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to shy away from talking about it, because I do believe that ultimately this war is spiritual, which is why discernment is key. So I want to end with that note about the importance of spiritual discernment and the spiritual quality of discernment in general, because at the end of the day, I don't believe that we live in an exclusively materialistic, realm. I think things are far more complex than that. So thanks for hanging in there with me on this video. I appreciate it. Like, subscribe to the channel, share this video. And again, the 4 things that I said that we can all do, maybe you're doing them, maybe you're not, maybe you can do them a little bit more. The 4 things that we can do to improve our ability to discern: consume information from a variety of sources and perspectives, engage in discussions and debates. You don't have to get into a fight. You can have a gentleman's discussion or a gentlewoman's discussion with your friends. Study logic and reasoning. And then also number 4, systems thinking. So thank you. I appreciate you guys, hanging out with me today and going through this video with me. And like I said, like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video if you would. Have a good one. Appreciate it.